International Relations Minister Naledi Pandor says a special envoy will visit the U.S. to avert losing billions in investments. There are fears that the relations between Pretoria and Washington could sour as a result of South Africa's stance on Russia. The delegation will be meeting with various stakeholders to avoid losing or denting the current investment. The U.S. visit will be led by Deputy Minister Elvis Bodes and also the advisor in the presidency. Joining us is Brooks Spector, Associate Editor at the Daily Maverick, to discuss this visit and what it potentially means. Brooks, thank you for making time for us. Do you think we were always going to pay the price, so to speak, for our so-called neutral stance on the war in Ukraine, or is our government overthinking this?
Well, I think there are always consequences to any decision that a government takes. For example, by the kinds of positions that the South African government has taken, by these very, very vigorous public pronouncements about good fraternal relations and partners, about military naval exercises, about sending party delegations, by having a senior official showing up in Russia to pledge support and friendship in military and security spheres, that's bound to have an impact on people in Washington. But let me add also that trade is not primarily and solely determined by governments. That is to say, a private company in American investment in Africa, although some of the investments are government guaranteed or are part of larger frameworks in which there is a portion of government money that helps to leverage the investment by the private sector. Investment decisions are made, generally speaking, by individual companies. And if they judge that the economy is worth investing in and that the country is sufficiently stable and solid that the investment will pay off, they will do that, whether or not the U.S. government tells them, think about this. But what can happen, and this is something you don't see much discussion of, but I think it's important to keep in mind, South Africa has been a very significant beneficiary of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is not a trade treaty, but which is American unilateral law, which allows thousands of African products duty-free access into the U.S. South Africa has been a very strong beneficiary of that, and this particular law expires in 2025, and whether it would be renewed or not is a question, but whether or not South Africa would be excluded from it would remain a possibility, because quite frankly, I've talked to some people, friends of mine in Washington, and they say there's an extraordinary amount of head shaking and disquiet over the way in which the South Africans have positioned themselves on the invasion of Ukraine.
So there's a lot at stake here. Is it possible, though, Brooks, for our government to iron things out with the U.S. to avoid losing billions in trade or compromising things like AGOA, given that our leaders in the president and even the international relations minister have been so steadfast and unapologetic in South Africa's close ties with Russia?
Well, I mean, it's, you'd have to ask the South African government if they're planning to make a change in their policy. I mean, I would, if they were to ask me, I would counsel them that they should, but that's not something I can do with whatever levers I might have. But I think that it is important that they get a realistic sense, the people who go to Washington to talk to government officials and hopefully to talk to business federations and business organizations and banks and other institutions considering investments, to hear from them what the impact is.
Yeah.
I think and I think they should not spend much time, for example, paying calls and having a party with old friends from the anti-apartheid movement. I mean, that's nice and it makes you feel good, but it's not what's needed now. Mm-hmm. What's needed now is to talk to members of Congress, to talk to congressional staffers, who are the people who actually prepare the position papers and in many cases for congressmen and women, and to talk to people honestly in the State Department and in the U.S. Trade Representative's office about what is possible and how they might conceivably ameliorate their stance. But I fear that they will go with a different kind of attitude, trying to convince people in Washington that, oh no, when we say we're neutral, we really mean it, even if the actions all around them seem to argue otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, the big question now is, will Putin attend the BRICS summit later this year, and will the South African government, in fact, arrest him, we are obliged to, so to speak, because we are a signatory to the Rome Statute, so we are a full member of the ICC, and the presidency recently said it's very much aware of government's legal obligations regarding the ICC. It's not just this relation with Russia that we have with Russia that's concerning the U.S., I would imagine, Brooks. There are escalating U.S.-China tensions, you could argue. So much has happened between the two countries, whether you talk about that shooting down of an alleged Chinese spy balloon by the U.S., which on its own escalated the tensions. So, and China is our big friend too. So how do we avoid being entangled in U.S.-China global rivalry?
Well, let's be clear that the U.S. and China have an extraordinary trade and investment relationship, even in spite of the tensions. I mean, it's not as if suddenly all the ports are closed to Chinese goods or vice versa. But there are clearly issues. It's certainly not a shooting war that embodies the U.S.-China relationship. That would change, obviously, were there some sort of overt actual military action, say, toward Taiwan. That would be a whole different set of circumstances, but let's park that one for a minute. Let me just go back for a second to your question about Vladimir Putin's potential for visiting the country in August. Remember, it's not simply that the South African government is a signatory to the Statute of Rome and therefore a member of the International Criminal Court. It's that the Statute of Rome was, as we say here now, a word I've only recently learned, domesticated the terms of that agreement into South African law. And so it becomes a matter almost immediately for the courts in the way that, if you recall, a few years ago with Omar al-Bashir. He visited, and he was also a warrant of arrest had been issued, and he was sort of smuggled out of the country, so to speak, from a military base. If I were advising the South African government, which they haven't called, although they certainly can, I would encourage them to think about ways that Mr. Putin could participate virtually, like you and I are talking now, which at least would not put them, South Africans, in the position of having to either ignore their own law or to be nice to a friend. And that's a difficult corner for them to get themselves into. If, for example, Vladimir Putin does visit and the South African government is very, very welcoming and warm to him, that would be a particularly difficult pill to swallow in Washington.
But what foot would Washington have? Suppose, do they have enough to stand on, is what I'm trying to ask Brooks, given that Washington itself is not a signatory of the Rome Statute. I mean, all they've done now is welcome the issuing of that warrant of arrest for Vladimir Putin. But if he comes here, and I mean, I saw the Deputy Minister of COCTA, is it Obed Bapela, who was a part of the delegation that the ANC sent to Russia, saying that South Africa is not going to be arresting a sitting president. That's not going to happen. And you've got other senior leaders saying Putin is welcomed in South Africa. So you put two and two together, you get a sense that they're not so too worried about, Putin coming here and them ignoring what their obligation is to the Rome Statute. But what I'm asking is, would Washington have something to stand on to criticize us, seeing that they themselves are not a signatory to the Rome Statute?
Well, in point of fact, there are a number of countries that aren't signatories, including the U.S., it's true, and including Russia as well. But the point, I think, that is crucial for South Africans is that the Rome Statute is part of South African law. And that becomes an issue not for what do international players say about what you do, but how do you adjudicate the government's relationship to its own law. And it's the kind of thing that, as in with Bashir, Omar al-Bashir, I keep getting his name backwards, I apologize. It went to the courts very quickly, and the issue, the order to adhere to South African law was issued, if you recall, but it was too late to deal with him. I think that what will happen is that there'll be a lot of tongue clucking in Washington if it happens. I think there will be, more important, there will be a fair amount of very strong criticism by the Republican Party members of the Congress. And remember, the Republicans now control the House of Representatives, and that's where AGOA renewal or South Africa's continued participation in it might likely rest. And I think that's the card that has to be one has to be aware of. Diplomacy is one of these things where if you do it right, you avoid having the confrontation. You avoid ending up with the chest bumping and the chest pounding in the jungle with each other. And you try to figure out a way not to do that, rather than how can we make the loudest amount of noise and screaming and yelling and carrying on. And in this case, it seems to me you end up very quickly backing yourself into a corner. No, we belong to the we are a signatory. It's our law, but we're not going to follow it. Is a very awkward position and very difficult hand to play. And that would be my reaction to it. And I think it's less important what people might say in the U.S. than the criticism domestically.
There have been some significant developments around our relations with the U.S. President Cyril Ramaphosa had audience with President Joe Biden a few months ago. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was here not so long ago. You had the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, who was also here. I can't remember the last time, Brooks, we attracted so much U.S. diplomatic attention. And you could argue just broadly so much diplomatic attention because we've been hosting some European leaders as well. I mean, Russian senior leaders have also been, government leaders have also been here in South Africa. Is it fair then to say the U.S. is worried and probably has reason to be worried about the prevalence of China and Russia on the continent? Is it feeling threatened, especially given that Pretoria also decided to host those military exercises with China and Russia and then decided to decline to host and participate in the planned Cutlass Express military exercises with the U.S. this year, without explaining why, apparently?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there is an increasing amount of international interest in the continent by major nations and some not quite so major nations as well. I mean, there are a number of countries in the second tier, places like Turkey and United Arab Emirates and a couple of others, who also angle for opportunities to come here. And competition's one thing, conflict is another, obviously. It's also fair to say, and you don't have to push me on it because I'll say it right out for you, that the previous administration in Washington put the U.S. on the back foot dealing with Africa generally through some fairly intemperate remarks and derogatory comments, and a general lack of any interest really in the continent. And that I think has meant that the Biden administration is doing a lot of, shall we say, catch-up. Not ketchup that goes on a hamburger, but catch-up as in trying to, to get back into the game. It's important to remember, though, that the investment decisions come out of business, not government. Yeah. And the investment decisions are being made partly on the basis of the calculations of stability and opportunity, but also, and we can never forget this, there's something like 500 million people on the continent who are either middle class by a generous definition of it, or aspirationally middle class, and the continent is young. The land's old, but the people are young. Average age on the continent is under 20. And all of these people, the aspirant middle class, the young people, they want to consume the products that the world makes and likes, and many of them, if they're in entertainment or if they're in communications or if they're in other kinds of consumer goods, they're either designed or made in the United States. And so that's where some of the interest must come from. So I guess what I'm really getting at is that there are several tracks that are running simultaneously. One is the official government's disapproval or dislike for the way in which South Africa may be handling its relationship with its supposedly neutral partner. Yeah. That's one. But then there's the other possibility that private business looks for opportunities, and they see it here. But then if you swing back to the government, it's a sense, as a friend of mine in Washington put it, the uniqueness of Madiba magic and the Rainbow Nation has faded. And South Africa is like everybody else.
Brooks Spector, Associate Editor at the Daily Maverick, thank you for joining us for this conversation.